everybody, and welcome to the weekly message for The Table. The Table is a church in Davenport, Iowa, where people are moving from greed toward generosity, from violence toward peacemaking, from isolation toward neighborliness, and from fear toward faith. I'm Pastor Rob Leverage, and it is good to be with you on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. Our sermon series this month is exploring the question, is grace sufficient? Is grace sufficient? And the reason that we're asking this question is that there are many things we face in this life that are so difficult or painful or overwhelming that we wonder if our faith can persevere. We wonder if we can persevere. We want to trust God, but sometimes, we confront things that cause us to question, is God's grace enough for me in the face of this? So last week we started off the first message by considering physical pain, physical sickness in the body, injury. We pray for all sorts of physical conditions all the time, and sometimes those conditions stay with us. So can grace be enough for us if our pain or sickness continues? And today, so that was last week's message. Today, this week's message, we're going to talk about guilt. Oh, man. All right. When you have said or done something truly wrong and you know it and you can't undo it and you understand the harm that you caused, or at least you understand some of the harm that you caused and you can't fix it, can grace be sufficient? Can we trust in grace when we are guilty? Okay, Christians talk a lot about God's love and about Jesus' willingness to die for the sins of the world. We proclaim a central fundamental truth that there is absolutely nothing that a person can do, nothing that can happen in this life that can separate us from the love of God made known to us in Jesus Christ. This is the gospel. But still, many of us struggle to fully accept or internalize or lean on this truth. I mean, maybe you want to believe it, right? Or you do believe it in one part of your consciousness, right? But you struggle to know that it's real. You struggle to really lean into the truth of this gospel message and promise, right? If you have done something truly wrong and it weighs on you like an anchor tied to your neck, how do you allow grace to set you free? This is our question for today. Okay. So perhaps we should start by defining grace. What do we mean when we say the word grace? Perhaps I should be doing that every week. I don't know why I didn't start there last week. But definition of grace. Grace is favor. Grace is goodwill. It is a spirit of benevolence that we can extend to others, so you or I can be gracious, right? And if we are gracious to another person, it means to offer favor, goodwill, kindness. Okay. And when we talk about God's grace, so God's grace is favor that is transcendent and ultimate. In this sense, grace is not just a good deed or a sort of, a joyful, positive sentimentality or a positive attitude or something like that. It is really a defining feature of the Almighty and Everlasting Holy One. It is the truest of true things. Okay. And we think of grace as essential to, or perhaps even the driving force behind, all of the essential activity of God. So God creates the world, and God creates our very lives from a spirit of grace. Okay. God helps us and forgives us and saves us because of grace. Okay. But not only that, God provides for us, provides strength, provides vision, provides purpose, all from a spirit of grace, goodwill, divine favor. Okay, that is grace. Okay. Now, when we sin, when we do harm, there are different ways that this takes shape, of course. Sometimes, a lot of what we do, a lot of the sin and, the stuff that we are guilty of, it comes from simple mistakes, errors in judgment, missteps, screw-ups. Other times, the guilt that we have is because we actively chose to do something evil for evil reasons. We knew something was wrong, we did it anyway. Or perhaps we did it because of how wrong we knew it was. Okay? But whether we're talking about a misstep, or a mistake, or we're talking about some kind of willful malevolence, we can still know intellectually that the grace needed for us to be forgiven and restored and made right, that grace is universal. It certainly exists long before we ever did the thing that we're guilty of. But knowing that, understanding that at a cognitive level doesn't necessarily free us from the weight of guilt. If you've ever been to church, you've probably heard a pastor or a priest instruct you on how to confess your sins to God, and they have proclaimed to you that God will forgive those who seek God's forgiveness. But even having heard that promise, you may still feel a burden of guilt. And friends, I think that is right. Guilt has some value. Not when it cripples us, but it is right to feel bad about having done things that are truly bad, if it's really bad. Sometimes we feel guilt about things we should not feel guilty about, small things that, were not really wrong, like somebody tried to cut you in line and you didn't let them and they got mad and now you feel guilty. Like, what is up with that guilt? That guilt is not helping anybody. But on the other hand, we have all observed people who have done things that are truly wrong, stealing from people, abusing people, and they don't feel bad about it at all, right? That is a big problem. A little guilt in that situation would probably help. So it is valuable for us to feel guilty about things that we've done that are really wrong, because that it demonstrates to us and to others that we care, right? If we feel, guilty about things that we've done, the guilt keeps us aware that other people matter, right? And other people's lives are important just like ours. The world does not revolve just around me or you. We are accountable, right? And so when we transgress, when we do harm, guilt is a motivator to address our wrongdoing and thereby keep our humanity intact. Okay? So guilt is not all bad, right? When we are guilty, of course, now there are good and healthy ways for us to respond to that feeling. Okay? The ideal outcome when we feel guilty is forgiveness. But I don't want to jump to that because, first of all, sometimes even when there is forgiveness, guilt still weighs on us. Okay, so we're gonna deal with that, right? At that point, the guilt is no longer helpful for anything. It's not helping anything, and that's why we're giving this message in the first place. But I also don't want to suggest that if we do some good and healthy things in in response to the feelings of guilt that we have, that we would do those things in order to achieve forgiveness or to earn grace. We need to be clear about this. We cannot do anything to force another person or a community to forgive us, right? And if you ever try to make somebody forgive you, you are definitely adding more harm to the situation. So beware of that. Often people who we have wronged will forgive us, but we are not in control of that. And unfortunately, we got to accept that. Okay? We also don't control God's grace. We cannot earn it. We cannot activate it through a correct series of actions. It is a gift that is freely given. Okay. On the contrary, the good and healthy things that we do in response to guilt that we feel, these things are not to achieve God's grace. They are actually because of God's grace. Okay, so we are empowered and enabled by grace to do the right thing. Remember, the grace of God, the grace that God bestows on us is not only forgiveness, it is creativity. It is generosity. It is a spirit that equips us going forward. Grace gives us things that we can do when we are guilty. Okay. First of all, we can confess. It's amazing how often people overlook this necessary action. We feel terrible about something, but we don't want to own up to it, right? Because there are costs associated with telling the truth about what happened. If you broke the law, right? And you feel guilty, to confess to the crime, there are consequences to that. If you betrayed somebody that you love, the truth of what happened is going to change that relationship because, that's just the way it is. We hesitate to confess, right? But we should realize that the relationship, because of this betrayal, even if it hasn't been confessed yet, even if the other person doesn't know what happened, we should realize the relationship is already changed because we transgressed, right? We did the thing. We committed the betrayal. And then if you try to hide it, then you're adding dishonesty on top of the transgression. So the relationship really cannot be what it was before. It is permanently changed. Now, the relationship could survive the betrayal, possibly, but healing is going to require honesty. Okay, so confession. When you confess, don't make excuses, right? And I'm not finger wagging here because I need to hear this message as much as anybody, okay? But when you confess, don't equivocate. Don't say, here's what I did wrong, but here's all of these reasons why it makes sense that I did what I did, and it's not so bad. And honestly, have you even seen what so-and-so does? What I've done in comparison, blah, blah, blah. No. Don't do any of that, okay? Just take responsibility, because if you're equivocating what you're saying, what's the more important thing is not for you to own up to the thing that you did wrong. The more important thing is for you to justify yourself, right? And that then if all you're really trying to do is justify yourself, this is not a confession. Okay, so if you're going to confess, you just take responsibility. I did this. That's what a confession is, right? And you actually own your mistakes. You own up to your wrongdoing. If you do that, you can ask for forgiveness. Now, as I said, you can't make somebody forgive you. But sometimes, it's easier for people to forgive you if you ask for it, because you're willing to say, what happened and how wrong you really were. Asking for forgiveness is a big deal. It's bigger than we realize. Think of how often we say sorry. Oh, sorry. Ooh, sorry, right? If you made a sorry journal and you tried to tally all the times you say sorry during a day, what is it going to be, 50 times, 100 times? We say it so commonly and casually in so many different kinds of situations. It's really like a buffer. It's like a shield. If you're really going to say, I'm sorry in a way that truly matters, you just have to slow down. You have to take a deep breath, make eye contact and say, I am sorry. Yeah, and that is the word sorry is a throwaway word in many cases. Now think about how often you say to someone, please forgive me. Honestly, when was the last time you literally said those three words, please forgive me? It may have been a long time, right? It's a lot harder to say that to say, please forgive me. It requires you to lay down all of your defenses and sit in the pain of the truth of your actions and your words and the uncertainty. You really don't know what the other person is going to say. They could forgive you or not, right? Other things to keep in mind with forgiveness: if you're willing to ask for forgiveness, you should remember forgiveness is not forgetting. The old expression, forgive and forget, that's not how forgiveness works, because you really have to grapple with the thing that you are forgiving. You have to stare it down unflinchingly. A person cannot say, I forgive, so I pretend like the thing never happened. Okay, you can move on, right? But you're not forgetting what happened. The reason that forgiveness is called for is specifically because the bad thing really did happen. See? Another insight about forgiveness that may be a little controversial. I'm not sure if people would consider this controversial, but I think we should ponder it together. It comes from Jewish traditions. In Judaism, people talk about only being able to forgive what happened to you. Okay? So you can't forgive on behalf of somebody else. You cannot forgive somebody for a thing that they did to somebody else. So if, for example, a man abuses his wife, and decades later he feels so guilty about it, and he apologizes to their daughter, who is now all grown up, and she cannot forgive her dad for abusing her mom. At least according to this way of thinking about forgiveness. She can forgive her dad for all of the consequences that his actions had for her, making her feel unsafe, all of the chaos in the home during her upbringing, the fear and the anxiety that she lived with as a child. She can forgive her dad for those things, but only his wife can forgive him for the abuse that he inflicted on her. Okay? Now, with this view of forgiveness, we recognize many cases in which we will not receive forgiveness from people, either because they withhold it consciously or they are unable to grant it. They may have died before forgiveness was sought or offered, or they may be unreachable in some other way, right? And that is yet another reason why we would ask the question, is God's grace sufficient? Because if we long for forgiveness from another person, if that is our hope, that desire may not be granted. We might experience the forgiveness of another person, but we might not. Okay? Then one more good and healthy response to the guilt that we experience. The guilt we experience, in the face of guilt that we experience for things that we have done, we can choose acts of restitution. Yeah. There are things that we can do to repair some of the harm that we have done. Restitution cannot fix things completely. It does not guarantee forgiveness, but it is the right thing to do. And it can help a guilty person carry on, knowing that they are turning from bad choices to good ones. A friend of mine was in a toxic relationship, plagued by a lot of issues. One big issue in the relationship was money. She and her boyfriend would plan to split the cost of big things that came up, significant expenses, or maybe a trip that they were going to take. And at the last minute, when they needed to pay for things, he would not have any money. And so she would cover the costs, and he would promise to pay her back. But that kind of thing kept happening over and over again. And as time went by, there came to be this big backlog of money that he owed her. And that is not good for a relationship. Not good. Eventually, she broke up with him because of this reason, but really there was actually a lot of reasons. It was not a good relationship. She needed to break up. He was devastated, and he wanted her to take him back. So he he sold his car, right? He sold his car, and he took the money to her house, and he said, "I am so sorry. Here is the money that I owe you." She accepted his apology, and she took the money, and she closed the door. Yeah. People who knew them could not believe that she would not take him back. I mean, he sold his car to show how much he cared. But you see, this was not merely an issue about how much he or she cared. She cared about him too, right? He owed that money, and it was his responsibility to pay her back. But fulfilling that responsibility, that does not mean that the relationship can or must be restored. And this is something that we need to understand about restitution. Doing the right thing does not get back the thing that was lost. If you break into somebody's house and you steal their TV, and later you regret your action and you want to make things right, you can replace the TV and you can pay to fix the window that you broke, but you can't replace the sense of safety and security that you took away from them. You can't remove the paranoia that you inserted into somebody else's life because you broke into their house. Restitution cannot completely fix what went wrong. But restitution is still right. Okay? My friend's ex-boyfriend did the right thing. He demonstrated honor and integrity by paying back what he owed. He had to face the loss of the relationship. He had to face that. He had to face the consequences. But he also proved that he was capable of doing right by a woman that he cared about. And that would be very important to any future relationship. Okay, so here we are. We are living with guilt. Okay? Our actions have caused harm. We are living with the truth of that. Let's say we believe in God's forgiveness. Okay? Or at least we're trying to. We're trying to believe that God forgives. And let's just say it's the best case scenario. We have been told that we have been forgiven by people whose lives have been affected by our actions. Okay? We confessed. We told the truth. We stared down the harm that we had done, and we have come to grips with our own capacity to make evil choices. We have said we were sorry. We asked for forgiveness, and we have taken steps to make restitution, to repair, to pay back. And even though we cannot undo what we did because there are things that cannot be restored, we have done the good that can be done, in the aftermath of this wrong, right? And we have been forgiven, okay? So this is the best case scenario in the aftermath of a grave sin. And our guilt has not left us, okay? The guilt is still there, like a brick in the belly. It's not going anywhere. I may believe in my head that I'm forgiven, but I know in my heart and I know in my gut that I am guilty. In this way, it's like the physical pain that we talked about last week. You prayed for the thorn to be removed, and it was not removed, right? And so it's from this place that we ask, can God's grace be sufficient for us. You know. Well, on one level, I'd say this is an individual concern. It's not really for me to say. It's between you and the Lord whether grace is sufficient, I suppose. you know. And yeah, there will be different people who answer the question differently. But I do believe that everything that you've done in this scenario to turn from the sin that incurred your guilt, all of that is already a gift of grace. It is by God's grace that you confessed. It's by God's grace that you made restitution and asked for forgiveness. It is, in fact, by the grace of God that you have come this far. Okay? And to my mind, perhaps the greatest miracle that we can attribute to God's grace is the miracle of freedom itself. You see, grace as God's unearned, freely given favor is a liberating truth that we are not chained to our past troubles, our past mistakes, our past sins. Because of God's grace, the way things were is not the way things must be. See? We do not have to remain the person who did those things that we now deplore. We can learn. We can grow. We can become more and more of who grace intends for us to be. We can. Okay. I recently heard a story, and this is a tough one to tell. It's a story told by Thich Nhat Hanh, the eminent Buddhist monk and peace activist. Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of an American soldier in Vietnam in the 1960s whose platoon was ambushed and his friends were killed. The soldier was consumed by rage, and he wanted vengeance like he had never wanted anything. So he trekked through the jungle, and he found a remote village, and he left a bag of poisoned food outside of a hut. He hid and watched as 5 little children came out and found the food and ate it. They very quickly became ill, and there was no medical care available in this village, so the kids all died. The soldier survived the rest of the war, and he went home to the U.S., where his life was a total mess. He couldn't sleep. He could barely eat. He was tortured by thoughts of those kids, those children that he had murdered. As intense and profound as his anger and his wrath and his lust for revenge over the loss of his friends had been, all of that passion and all of those thoughts were now surpassed 100-fold by the guilt and the self-hatred that he carried. He was headed on a path toward suicide. But he attended a spiritual retreat led by Thich Nhat Hanh and others, which focused on cultivating peace within the self. That seemed like an impossible task for him. But after several days and the relationships he was building with the other participants and with the leaders, he felt that he could and should and that he needed to open up, and he spoke to the leader about his past, about his crime. He told what he did. He had never told anyone before then. And he said, I can never be forgiven for this. I can never forgive myself, and I can never change what I did. Right? Thich Nhat Hanh's response was, it is true. you did this. You killed 5 children. That's the truth. But your life is not over. And there are 5 children who will die today because they don't have enough to eat, or because they don't have medicine, or because of violence in their community. And there will be 5 children tomorrow and the day after that. And their deaths will not be caused by you. But you might be able to do something to prevent those deaths. You might be able to help those children have nutrition and medicine and safety that they may grow and live. And if you were able to save those children, then you might feel the children from Vietnam smiling upon you from the great beyond, because you were able to turn your guilt into helpful action. And he asked, can you think of anything that you could do to help 5 children survive? And perhaps after that, 5 more. And after that, 5 more. And the man could think of things that he could do. He thought of many things that he could do, because he had a life, and he had some resources, and he had some time, he had some strength, some energy. He had things that he could do, not to change the past, but to carry the past in his calling to shape the future. He left that retreat and he got to work. This is a true story, though Thich Nhat Hanh did not give the details, the man's name or anything like that. And I don't know how much guilt he still felt in the years that followed. But according to the story, that guilt did not prevent him from living well. Friends, the grace of God is a creative grace. By grace we are forgiven of our sins, but that is just the beginning. Grace says the story is still being written, and the sins of the past are not the final word. For some of us, the burden of guilt is great indeed. And if grace were to be sufficient for us, it would need to be extraordinary. The good news is that's the kind of grace we get. Thanks be to God. Amen.